reflect a specific space and place. And so much of my professional practice has been and is still focused on working with people to try to elicit tacit knowledge and insights from their lived experience in order to better inform decision-making within projects. So oftentimes these lived experiences are of systems that are designed for, but without voices and stories of its participants. So namely in my background, it's been students in education and patients in healthcare. Great. So as part of this professional practice, I mainly utilize material making and exploration as a means to help participants articulate the story of these lived experiences within the structure of a workshop, or where we find ourselves today on a virtual seminar type thing. Now, as workshops become a more prevalent part of my own and others' professional practice, especially digitally, designers and researchers can be faced with an overwhelming amount of data at the end of these workshops or seminars, right? We have generated visual materials, like this visual metaphor. We have sort of recorded audio. Like here, I've done material exploration through a Think Aloud protocol that I recorded. Of course, we have our Zoom recordings. This is the meta Zoom recording. We have our classic Post-its and notes and whiteboard notes now. We have our surveys and feedback. And of course, we have performances and share-outs. Now, a designer or researcher can easily get stuck in a state of action paralysis when it comes to making sense of all of this data, especially when it's experiential. So now, in the context of lived experiences, a designer or a designer researcher can use more traditional research methods to try to make sense of all that data, such as surveys and questionnaires that help explain what has happened, and interviews and observations and focus groups that aggregate understanding that helps to describe why it happened. And of course, there's been a tension that I've felt in practice over time with the frustration of being tasked and asked to move from a looking backwards analysis to a looking forwards ideation. The need to translate sort of a past tense into a future design. And having to pivot what has happened into a what might be. And I sense that some of us feel that same frustration here today. And so such research methods necessitate an extensive time spent with the data, analyzing it over many sort of weeks and months. So what I'm looking at is how probes and prototypes and other making methods can support participants' abilities to analyze and envision new futures, or in our case, hopefully today, anticipate what might happen. And I think a lot of us try to do that as well in our own practice. So here and today, I am experimenting with a scaffolded process that I'm calling analytical engagement, which we'll see in the narrative panoramas, that sort of aims to support participants to interpret and analyze their own stories of past lived experiences. And the shift there is really so it gets to a more co-analysis within co-design, that it's not just me walking away with your lived experience, trying to synthesize it and make sense of it, but we do the interpretation and analysis sort of together in real time. So that's why I'm sort of investigating how the act of making can act as a mechanism for coding and interpreting your own data. And the motivation for this is twofold, right? It's one, to provide a mechanism for data interpretation and analysis in real time, but it's also to provide a platform for participants to engage more equitably within the analysis phase of a project. Yeah, and that part's pretty, that's sort of like my passion part of it, is the more equitable part in the analysis. So what is analytical engagement that we'll see in today's sort of activity? So participants and today will be prompted to reflect on and translate a lived experience into physical form. And this material translation acts as a way to sort of code your own narrative data. And we'll sort of see that in practice today. I ask participants to then start interpreting these material forms, this narrative data, by viewing these forms literally from above and around to start interpreting surrounding factors, right? I'm also asking people to sort of look at the forms from a distance to extend the interpretation out wider one more time, allowing peripheral factors to emerge. So we'll sort of walk through that stage today. And of course, the fourth sort of prompt and step in this is to start analyzing it. And themes that emerge within the interpretation, this viewing of your own material form, is sort of used as the prompt for analysis. And the intention here for analysis is to provide support in decision making, not prescription after the workshop ends, or the seminar in this case. These prompts are that we'll go through are meant to conceptualize what might emerge within future experiences, acting as an opportunity to move away from what has happened into what might happen, into more of that anticipatory sort of design frame, through a series of actually written prompts. So we'll end the day with sort of a writing activity. And these are some of the prompts that we'll get to later, but it will be part of our writing exercise. So I'll just sort of end it there really quickly. So by introducing this thing I'm calling analytical engagement, I'm investigating whether participants can be better supported to make sense of a lived experience, and if it acts as a more manageable approach to data analysis within co-design, which of course brings us to today, right? And so a little bit about framing of how this works for today and for public pedagogies. Today's framing is really around the built environment that serves as a reflection of ourselves. It can reflect, it can obstruct our needs and wants, motivations, desires, especially now that we live most of our lives in digital spaces and places and locations and environments. Our daily lives are now translated and transported into these spaces. The border between physical and digital are merging and becoming more obscure as we navigate these digital spaces in our own homes or wherever we find ourselves today. So what I'm really fascinated in investigating today is, are these digital locations serving our needs, or are they confronting the limitations of physical, cultural, and social barriers we find in the workplace, our schools, our hospitals, our essential services? And how might we better understand how these digital ecologies affect and reflect our lived experiences in order to better design for or mitigate with? So how might we today communally analyze some of these questions? How might we analyze some of these digital experiences and locations? So we're actually going to walk through a bit of that activity today. Helen and I will help prompt you to do and think and go through it. But before we do all of that, of course, I wanted to pause for any questions or clarifications. I'm unsure if I've cut out at any point. So let me know if you have any questions or clarifications you would like to have me answer.
You've come across loud and clear, Kelly, from my perspective, so I think it's all good.
For the first time, you know, it's coming together. So today, I'll prompt you to engage with some of the prompts. I understand that we probably have distractions or sort of maybe obstructions in our own spaces and places we find ourselves. So at any point, if something isn't working, feel free to adapt the prompts as needed today. So this is completely flexible and adaptable to wherever you find yourself, however you find yourself in this space, whether it's loud or quiet or whatever. So yeah, so I'll just sort of end it there. Great. So
so we have a question from Victoria,
okay.
who it's really pertinent to her research, and she's wondering, have you got any anything published yet in this area that she could cite? So we'll provide, Kelly, we'll provide something for that
Oh
one.
yeah, it's a really great question. I'm in the process of getting published for the first time in my research, so it's sort of a yes, but not right at this current second. But yeah. Anyway,
Beautiful.
it's a weird thing to think about and say out loud. But great. So I think we could jump into it, and feel free to ask any questions as we go along. And Helen and I will be looking out for the chat and questions and whatnot.
Kelly, do you want to talk about the consent form
Yeah.
as well?
So
I've popped that in the chat for people to look at a bit around participating in your research. Yeah.
yeah, so I've put my email here. So I'll ask for anybody who is willing to share photos or notes of how you responded to today's prompts, if you're willing to, and if you're willing to allow me to use that for further documentation, to also fill out. It's a very, very short consent form. So I'll remind everybody at the very end of today. But if you would like to share with me anything that you've done or written down, thought through, feel free to email me. And of course, quickly sign the consent form to allow me to use any of that. I tried to make the consent form as simple as possible because it's just probably another tab on everybody's computer. Great. So yeah, let's jump into it. I'm going to begin with giving us about 5 minutes. We probably might not need all of the time that I've allowed for. But wherever you find yourself right now, I want you to simply silently reflect on the place you spend most of your digital life. And thinking about what comes to mind, how you feel, any sort of effects that you get from this reflection. I want to give us a couple minutes to really think about the place that we spend most of our digital life.
So Kelly, by that, do you mean the actual room that you're in, or your digital life in the cloud?
I suppose in the cloud,
Yep.
I'm not really looking for any specific answers. So if there's variety there or how you've interpreted it, that's perfectly fine too.
Great, great.
If you want to write down some notes, thoughts of your reflection, feel free to. Feel free to sort of get up and walk around the room if you'd like to walk and reflect. I'll give us an inordinate amount of time to just sort of think with this for a second. While you're imagining this digital life of yours and the place you spend most of it in, think about your reaction to it. How did your mind and body actually react to you thinking about this space and why that might be? Now that we reflected on the spaces of our digital life and where we spend most of it, I want us to translate this into form. Whatever came to mind with whatever materials are literally available in front of you. And that could be your water bottle, it could be a pair of scissors, it could be a cup, a mug, a lamp, paper, pens, whatever you have in your vicinity, pillows, whatever. Translate what came to mind into form. And I made a note here, this could be as simple or complex as you like. However you feel is appropriate to your reflection. And if you make this material on your desk, on the floor, on a table, wherever it is, it's perfectly fine as well. This is really up to you to experiment with how you might translate that into a visual language, into visual form. I gave us 10 minutes here. I don't know if we need all 10 minutes, but
Yeah,
please,
fine.
yeah, please take as much time of that 10 minutes as you need. Now's the time to sort of, we'll organize breakout rooms,
Yep.
and with whomever you end up with in the pair or three, share what you made, what thoughts you had around this, the sort of context that it's supposed to represent, and really take note of any similarities across the two stories. This we'll sort of pay attention to the similarities between the across the stories in the next couple prompts. So. And so now that we're back together, now that we're sort of coming back from having shared conversations about whatever it is that we made into material form, what it might have represented and what it sort of means in our own life. Take another second right now to sort of sit with it, silently reflect on maybe a common theme that sort of came up between or among the stories shared. And I want you to actually take time to write it down or type it down. I mentioned here the common theme can be a word, it could be a short phrase, but something that resonated with you that was shared between the stories. And take a second to sort of write it, jot it, type it down somewhere. Just take another minute to sort of think through this. Short word, phrase, common theme shared that resonated with you. As you wrap that up, I'm going to prompt us to do a couple things individually, silently with ourselves. So feel free to turn your cameras off and mute yourselves at this point if you want to, if you feel the need to. Because now we're going to do two things. So one, I want you to just take time to literally look from above or around your form and just think to yourself, what sort of surrounding factors emerge within that view? You might want to stand up and look down. You might want to spin your forms around. You might want to walk around it. However you want to literally and physically engage with this form or forms you've created. Look from above and around and think, what's surrounding this thing? Just sort of silently think to yourself for a few minutes about that. Take another minute or two to really give space to what's surrounding this context or form. Sit with it a little bit. The next sort of view I want to propose and prompt you through is, however possible, with space and mobility as concerns, look at what you made from a distance. So as far as possible, maybe it's across the room, maybe it's down the hall, maybe it's just wheeling your chair away. But in this view, however you can give yourself distance from what you made, what peripheral factors are emerging? What is sort of scaled out one more time? What is emerging from that distance? Think through that a little bit. Give yourself a few minutes to sort of sit with that, think through that. Feel free to get up, stand around, walk around, give yourself a bit of a break. To jump up and take a bit of a break if you need to, because this next part, I'm going to ask you to, whatever common theme or phrase you wrote down, I want us to use that to sort of fill these sentences out. So I have an example here. If the common theme or identified sort of similarity that you thought about between the stories was something like fear, you could imagine part of the sentence being finished as fear creates confusion. Fear creates disillusion, or whatever it is. I want us to spend a good amount of time to sort of do as many of these sort of prompted sentences as you could. sort of imagining what would emerge from each of these from the same common theme. If you've identified a couple themes, feel free to fill out the sentences as relevant to those needs, or to those themes as you identified. But give yourself some time to sort of sit here, write down, type out, jot down these sort of prompted sentences as fill in the blanks. Yeah, part of today is sort of seeing the potentialities or the boundaries in which something like this can play out. So I would love for people to experiment with however they can. Dedicate this last half an hour, obviously it's a seminar, which infers that there will be discussion. At this point, this is really, the rest of this time is really dedicated to just sharing what came up, what sort of affected you, not just of this activity, but of course, what does this say about our digital ecologies and environments? To sort of go back to what I was initially framing at the beginning of this time that we had, I was really talking about as we navigate spaces digitally in our own homes, you know, how are they serving our needs or confronting the limitations we already see in our physical or cultural or social barriers, whether it's in the workplace or schools or hospitals or other institutions and public spaces and essential services. How might we actually better understand these digital ecologies that affect and reflect our own lived experiences? How might we communally analyze these new digital experiences and locations? That's sort of how I was initially framing this, sort of a reimagining of this sort of potential that we find ourselves in. But really, feel free to share any thoughts, anything that came up for you. I don't really have any other sort of specific prompts. I was just going to give the last half an hour to just a full discussion. And I might stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, great.
Go back to the confronting face-to-face in Zoom. But yeah, I just wanted to really give space to people to share out anything that came up for them, how this might have allowed them to see something new or different, or whatnot. And feel free to continue just putting it in chat if you don't feel like you want to verbally articulate as well.
One of the themes that came up for us was the negotiation of personal space. Anyone who's noticed the axe behind me should get, there's a little bit of extra. I don't know if you can award points, but can you see that yellow
Yes.
axe? So a week ago, I noticed that this has been in the back of my Zoom meetings. And so we had a tree chopped down. My wife's been going, and you know, it's quite expensive to get rid of stumps as well. So my wife's just been doing 10 minutes a day in the backyard, and she comes, and usually there's a space for the axe on the other side, but she comes in this door and leaves it there. And I only just noticed it. So we sort of had a laugh about that in my group because Chantel actually noticed it last week when we were as part of this conference. So it's that, where are your lines with the personal space? And I don't know, anyone noticed also when we started this morning, I had laundry on this chair. My personal line has been to try and I'd move the laundry. That, but I'm also sort of enjoying the fact that that sort of illusory separation between our formal presented selves and our sort of more messy everyday personal selves is getting blended in sometimes embarrassing ways and sometimes just playful ways.
Well, I think that's really fascinating, this idea of like things that confront identities or things that we don't maybe proactively share with our colleagues or don't have room or space to really show personality at work. And you know, those who can show those things or share those things versus those who might always share or always hide or whatever. It's fascinating.
It's so funny because just last night, my partner and I were discussing this very thing, and he was saying how fed up he is with seeing people in their personal spaces. He's sick of the distraction of it, and he thinks it's something has changed through this. And I was saying quite the opposite, how much I'm so curious about people's spaces. So whether there's a gendered thing, but what's interesting is he has over time curated his space. He's moved, his machine, he's laid out prints in the background so that there is a backdrop that he has chosen and curated, whilst of course I'm just in a space with all its mess. But that's so funny about the axe. I love that story.
Yeah, that's...
I've noticed a similar thing, Victoria. I have two different spaces that I Zoom from depending on what's happening. So the first week of the seminars, I was in a room quiet because I have a very noisy dog. But now I'm in my office space, which I've rearranged and cultivated stuff anyway. But there's also parts of the other room that there's places I won't sit depending on who else is in the Zoom. Because I don't want, and those who have been in meetings with me in that room will know that there's particular things that I don't want on display. So I'm really aware of that, of cultivating where I'm sitting depending on the meetings that I'm in. So.
Yeah, Karen and I had a bit of we disagreed a bit about the worlds that we've got on screen. Not surprising. But anyway, and she was seeing it as this time as extending her world and seeing all these other worlds, and they become part of her world. So what was out there became part of her world. I notice in these times how, for me, this is part of this private and public collapse. Well, actually, it's not what I mean is the public invading the private. And in COVID times, I don't know about you, but I feel as if the public is invading my space all the time, saying how many people I can have in my house and what time I can go to bed and whether I can drink coffee or not. And this world also is, I see it not extending my world, but as the public invading my private world. And, hence I'm doing this from Karen's study, not my study.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting time because I was fortunate recently to be in Queensland for 3 months, and so I missed part of the Melbourne lockdown. I'm actually back here now. But I'm involved in a couple of committees and clubs, and usually when you're away from your home, you don't have to go to any meetings because, they're face-to-face, and you've got a very legitimate excuse of being out of town and away. And yet what I found was because everything was on Zoom, you're suddenly, it doesn't matter where you are,
available.
You're available, and there's no excuse for not being on apart from being terribly ill or something like that. So it was kind of like invaded that space that's normally been recreation, chill out, and and there were times when my partner and I were both on different Zooms together. It was just. So it is a kind of a bit of an I hear what you're saying, Mary. It's a bit of an invasion of that space that in other times has been quite sacred, and it's
Interesting idea about the sacred there. And that personal, really interesting. Yeah.
I just, if it's all right, I wanted to share, I noted in the thing that it was a really interesting process because the theme, if it's all right, I'll share what I wrote down in response to the prompts because it's too hard to type. I do a lot of writing by longhand anyway. So the common theme that I wrote down was being pulled in and drowning all the Zooms and consumed, and that time changes and there was a pull to escape, and that was kind of what was in our three-way chat. So I wrote down, just as the thing started, being consumed creates irritation and a feeling of wanting to escape. Anyway, then I wrote, being consumed creates a pull to escape. Being consumed negates control. Being consumed lessens awareness of time. Being consumed worsens disconnection. Being consumed requests surrender. Being consumed demands attention. Being consumed encourages presence. Being consumed discourages distance and presence. Being consumed refuses detachment. Being consumed allows immersion and illumination. And just as I got to the end of writing that, Helen started talking in the chat and I got irritated, and I went, what? So I wrote down, I just got pulled out of my exploration and I got irritated by that. And I was really interested. I realized I was completely consumed by what I was doing. And as well as that, the whole thing was, I realized through that whole process that my thing that I created, for those who weren't in my group, that's what it was. So basically that's me being consumed. Anyway, the others were drowning, and yeah,
Wow.
But the interesting thing about that was I realized that it's a metaphor for my computer and my life, really. But that whole idea of the impact that technology or my computer's having on me, not what impact I'm having on it. So
That's just
instead of consuming digital stuff, I'm being consumed. So,
Yeah, wow.
So it's a really interesting process, I thought, to sort of get yourself completely lost in what you're doing and then go, oh, what? Anyway, so great, thanks. That was really awesome, Kelly.
No, I really appreciate that. I'll sort of very quickly, because I want to give this time back to you, this sort of unintentionally, this sort of process or scaffolding or whatever it is, process got sort of started years and years and years ago when I was in my master's program and working in New York City public schools. And I love being in schools. I love being with students. Education's a really big passion of mine because I didn't have a good one up until recently. So I've always loved being in schools. And so I was working with administrators and teachers who worked with a lot of undocumented students, and they just didn't have a good way of asking, because you can't ask, hey, you're an undocumented student, tell me about your experience, but they know they needed to know about the experience. So this was an attempt, and a very sort of messy one that they sort of helped create, way of sort of articulating the inarticulate, whether you don't know how to articulate or can't or don't want to. And so it really stems from this place that you could feel but you can't say, or you don't know how to say it, especially for teenagers or those who speak a different language than me, or have a different experience that is not mine to understand, but is needed to maybe work with. So that's really where it comes from. It comes from that place of sort of listening and caring and trying to find. So I'm glad you had that experience. It's something that's very dear to my heart and why I care about equity in analysis. Whether or not you think that's analysis, that's a different conversation. But I'm glad you had that piece of feedback. And I'll sort of stop talking there, and give space to others who want to share out as well.
Yeah, and the exercise to generate future affordances was really, really powerful. And in our sharing in the breakout room, form was a common theme. And just very briefly, what that allowed us to look at was we both had sort of material forms laid in different ways. And, for example, so form creates openness, form negates denial, form lessens ambiguity, form encourages affect, form discourages silence. So it's sort of, just sort of helping to tip things around a bit. And so really commenting, Kelly, probably on that process. I don't sort of need to analyse the nature of form and our relationship to that, that's sort of another story. But yeah, it's still the mess in that, and the mess of the digital environment and our lives, and also in the messiness there's experience, and that it's still lived experience in some way, but different for all of us, different times and spaces.
Kelly, Terry's asked a really interesting question about the reading, and whether you could say something about the reading and where it fits into what we've been doing today.
Yeah, it was, I tried to find a very short reading, so that's why I chose that one particularly, but around affect or emotion or the felt experience itself. I think a frustration of mine, especially because I've worked in nonprofit education and been around healthcare in a multitude of ways and spaces. I think one frustration I felt is the inability to capture affect, and there's a billion ways of describing what affect is, or disciplinarily situating it. But I think just the felt experience of going through one of these institutions, it's really hard to grasp. We have ways to qualify or quantify these things, but oftentimes without the participants themselves, often reducing down to numbers or responses or response rates, which is like perfectly fine. But as a designer, I have to future state those sort of findings. And so moving from understanding what has happened or why it happened into understanding what might happen or how to design anticipatorily through anticipation is one frustration. So affect is something I've been trying to sort of grasp tangibly. So I'm sort of rambling on all of that. I think one of the frustrations / opportunities I see is oftentimes we do focus groups, interviews, chats with our sort of, whether they're students or patients or stakeholders. And we start with asking the question of like, how does it feel to be in our program, or whatever the question is. I found that to be a disservice to participants. You have to, we've spent 45 minutes sort of just thinking and writing before speaking. And I think any of us who are educators, asking the explicit question is not going to give you an in-depth response, because you have to allow people to sort of give space for that. So I'm imagining this sort of filling the gap between the interview question, so like the space before the interview question or the focus group question. Something like this can be at play. So when we get to the question, there is a multitude of ways to articulate this thing. So I don't know if that answered specifically about the affect in that specific article, but I thought it was interesting how they spoke about it in a very real way.
I really appreciate the this approach for some of these reasons that we're talking about, because as Shannon and I were talking through what we had sort of formed, and then as we're analyzing it, we were sort of in our mind reforming the context that it expressed. I thought Bronwyn and Lucy both brought up a number of seeming contradictions and complex thoughts as they were putting up their form, like things that don't seem to fit together. And Shannon and I both had those in what we had created, right? Feelings of comfort and guilt, feelings of fulfillment and weakness. And in that regard, like those weren't necessarily things that we recognized until we ourselves sat down to analyze what we had formed and what we had created. And I thought that was one of the strengths of this form of I don't want to say form of research or analysis, because it's not quite what is, but like, I thought that was a good strength, because it, I think, allows the voice to come through more strongly, and the voice of the participant to analyze what the participant has already said and reframe it in maybe like a more concrete manner, and to look back. So I think in that regard, it strengthens the voice of the participant and sort of reduces the point of the voice of the writer or the researcher in that. And I thought that was this was something that I'm looking forward to using because I thought that that was a good strength that's difficult to find in other spots of qualitative research.
Yeah, I think you articulated something that I sort of stumble through trying to express of like, when I talk about equity or equity in research, it's more about what you were just saying. I sort of flinch when I hear things like outlier data or anecdotal data. I sort of cringe because I'm like, you can't tell a kid that their data is insignificant because they're outlier. And so I sort of cringe at that, but I understand why we say those things in the patterns of data and stuff like that. But so I think what you were just saying is so spot on with what I'm trying to attempt to investigate with. There was a comment in the chat around how is experiencing affect different or separated from emotion and feeling. And I think to me, it's about, I mean, to me, it's all a bit, it could be very arbitrary or down to semantics and what is the difference between emotion and feeling and affect. And for me, it's the language or words we use isn't as important as how participants can grasp a hold of what's happening in their experience, whether they think it's feeling or emotion or affect, to me is not important if they distinguish or they don't, or they use them all interchangeably. But I think it's a place to start with understanding that when we talk about online learning, it's not just Zoom, right? It's this inability to, or the confrontation of identities. It's all of these things that we're talking about when we're talking about online learning. It's not just you click on and put in a passcode and we're learning all of a sudden. It's all these other things that are hard to grasp or qualify or quantify in a way that traditionally we might try to. That was a non-answer, so I apologize on that.
I was just reflecting and carrying on the theme of noticing that immediate experience when you asked that prompt, and what my very first thought was, and it wasn't, it was in a sort of infinite space. I went from having complete openness to letting this thought come, and then almost immediately was gone because my mind was replacing it with other sort of thoughts. But that very first observation, or that very first thought that came in was the quality of that was, it's almost like by grace that it came as a result of your question. I wouldn't, to create that for yourself is almost impossible, I think. It was, yeah. And I'm only sort of reflecting on that because of that theme of noticing, but also I feel like I could go back and it's almost infinite how extensively that could be explored. And I didn't realize it before. It's sort of, yeah, not in the same way.
Fantastic. Kelly, what an experience this has been. I think the process has been incredibly revealing you know, really reflective and really satisfying. So yeah, there's something about the experience and what you've taken us through that's been actually really powerful, actually. So thank you so much, Kelly, for this work. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, everybody. This has been an incredibly generous time and space with everybody here. So I really appreciate your willingness to show up to something you didn't know what would happen and engage with it. So thank you, everyone.